Welcome to Brave Inflections. My name is Claudelle von Eck. I'm the founder of Brave Inflections. I have with me Pam Kleinot. This is the second interview that I have with Pam. If you haven't yet listened to the first video, I really encourage you to go and listen to that conversation. We talk about very, very important things that leaders should be taking into consideration, but I'll just give you this little bit in terms of the crux of it. It really boils down to self-awareness and self-care. Pam has got quite an interesting history, a variety of things that she's done. So I'm going to just touch on the three most important. And that is, she used to be a journalist at the height of apartheid in South Africa, in the thick of things, and did really, really important work. For example, with the Rand Daily Mail, and then she went through a huge phase, I would think, Pam, in terms of your career as a psychoanalytical psychotherapist and group analyst, and now busy with filming documentaries on social issues. It seems like, Pam, if I look back at your history, there's a definite theme there, isn't there?
Yes.
And it's interesting how, and I suppose, let me rephrase this. If I were to talk to little Pam at the age of 7 years old, and I told her she was going to be filming documentaries on social issues, do you think that is what little Pam had in mind?
No, but I was thinking, when I was 7 years old, it was the first time I became aware of apartheid.
Sure.
After the Sharpeville massacre. And it touched me very deeply.
Sure. And that's a great intro to where I want to go with our conversation, because Sharpeville was a very, very important event on the map of South Africa's history, with a lot of trauma. And if one thinks about trauma and the impact it has, I want to specifically bring it to the world of work. How do you think trauma impacts on how we show up at work?
I mean, it's a very broad question, but trauma can manifest through the mind, body, and feelings. And it can show up as depression, anxiety, psychosomatic issues. That's where the body is carrying something. Suicidal thoughts, low self-esteem, violence, anger, difficulty with emotional regulation. It's just very broad, that. It can show up in work through absenteeism, through anger, through violence, difficulty in relationships, conflictual patterns, having grievances, always challenging, anti-authority, difficulty, again, in regulating emotions.
You're mentioning all the kinds of things that we would just fire people for.
Yes, but I guess you actually have to have systems in place where that can be dealt with. Yeah. If bosses have the time to actually see what's going on, because that's just the symptom of something much deeper.
And I guess where I'm going with saying, you're listing the things that we just fire people for, is that more often than not, all we see is a difficult employee who does not fit into our culture, and we need to get rid of that person. But we very seldom stop to think about what informs the behavior, and that it could very well be trauma that's informing the behavior.
In most cases, I would say yes. But when you think about the workplace, they're not there social workers or psychologists. They're there. They want productivity. But obviously, increasingly, people are taking more welfare of the person into account. And that's why they have human resources departments and to look into that.
Yeah.
and to maybe give, if there's an alcoholism problem, to maybe help the person get off alcohol. They recognize they've got a good employee, but there are problems. And how can you help that person become better?
Yeah.
And understanding themselves. And then in turn, that person usually has a loyalty to you for helping them. So I think it also has a payback for employers.
Yeah, it does. And I suppose there is a little bit of the question is, where does your responsibility as a leader begin and where does your responsibility end? And what we are seeing these days is more and more pushback on organizations where there is just this absolute lack of empathy, and where sometimes organizations themselves or leaders in organizations are the cause of trauma.
Or they exacerbate the trauma.
Yeah.
Because the trauma, how we manage trauma obviously is related to how our early childhoods and how we manage our lives.
But the one that I wanted to get to, which really interested me, I wanted to have a conversation with you because I think it's very important in lots of contexts, but particularly in the South African context, is transgenerational trauma. Could we just maybe talk about what that is? Because I think lots of people have never heard of it. Yes, what is transgenerational trauma?
Transgenerational trauma is often referred to as intergenerational trauma. It's defined usually as trauma that gets passed down from one generation to another, to the next one. It is about a historical traumatic experience or events that are shared by a group of people within a society or an entire ethnic group, like slavery, like the Holocaust, like famine. And when a society goes through massive trauma, it's engraved on the memory of its population for generations and impacts on behavior. So that's part of the unconscious collective memory that people carry. It was first identified among children of Holocaust survivors, but has also now been identified in other groups. So parents may transmit their intrinsic vulnerabilities onto their children, which is triggered by their own traumatic experiences. And it may come that parents might have difficulty bonding with their children or creating healthy emotional relationships or attachments to their children.
Sure.
You see, where in early childhood, your attachments form the template of how you're going to relate in life. And when you feel secure, and very few people have that kind of safety and security. Let's not delude ourselves. So you form that very early template of all these different types of attachments, disorganized attachment, ruptured attachments, growing up with just, father or mother disappearing, all kinds of things. So what we have is single trauma, which is related to a single event. It could be an assault where you've been hit. Complex trauma happens when there have been a series of repeated traumatic events and may involve a whole family in incidents of violence, addiction, and poverty, which very much relates to South Africa and other places.
Yeah.
And in every act of violence, for instance, there's an undigested trauma and unmourned loss. And often the underlying thing in carrying trauma on and on and on is not mourning what you lost, whether it be in childhood, whether it be historically, whatever. And often people didn't talk about their traumatic lives because it wasn't what people did.
Yeah. You just soldier on.
You soldier on, but you also get a lot of myths and misconceptions. And people create stories and folklores. You see, that can be, and also in the history books at school, like when I grew up in South Africa, We knew very little about, Black history or slavery. You knew all about the Boer War and the triumph and that kind of thing. But you didn't know about in 1652 when Jan van Riebeeck came and they all took the land, and there was no malnutrition in South Africa until all this invasion of people, where land was stolen. So that was never portrayed. So you grew up with a completely distorted, skewed sense of history. And I think it happens in Britain, where I live now. They certainly didn't teach about slavery and their part in it, or imperialism and colonialism. So you grow up with these misapprehensions, and you pass them on, and it forms prejudices and fear of the other and all kinds of things. So basically, and I spoke earlier that people often don't talk about it. So traumatized people are unable to tell their stories through words. Now, unconsciously communicated their narratives through enactments, through being violent to other people, through their prejudices.
Sure. That's interesting. Being violent to other people could have its roots in your own trauma that you're not able to express verbally.
Exactly. And South Africa is a very violent country.
Yeah, and violence begets violence.
Absolutely, violent, and in Israel, yeah, you get repeated cycles because they're not interrupted.
Yeah,
and things aren't mourned and digested as a society.
Things are not mourned and digested as a society.
As a society.
Yeah.
They're not done individually, so they're not going to be done as a society. So.
Yeah. And I've often said that, just looking back, having grown up in the South African context, that some of the things that we experienced and we saw as children, we were never debriefed. And that's exactly what you're talking about.
Yes, so you carry these raw emotions, these uncontained emotions, and you didn't have anybody to hold you and say it's all going to be all right. I mean, so maybe some people did have that, but it wasn't really processed.
How do you then know as an individual that you may be, that you need to deal with transgenerational trauma in your own life?
Well, I think you have the symptoms of depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, relationship difficulties. It's not to say nobody, people, it's going to be on a continuum. All people are going to have various difficulties, and nobody's untraumatized in life. You don't need to go through a Holocaust or slavery to be traumatized. You can just have a cold mother, a cold father, rejecting or being abandoned. It can be as simple or neglected. And those are very hard things to measure.
So am I hearing you saying then that it's about recognizing your behavior, your inner thoughts that may be negative, and then perhaps you need to seek help to link it to what the real issue is?
Or to say when you may have alcoholism issues, eating issues, when I spoke about earlier, self-esteem issues, that could all be rooted in trauma or transgenerational trauma. I mean, it's traumatic events, and then you can go into, and sometimes when you understand historically your parents' difficulties that they went through, you can have more empathy for them instead of feeling more anger and that they let you down, and probably they didn't have those containing or warm, cuddly feelings when they were very little. They grew up in wartime or whatever it might have been.
Yeah.
Or poverty.
a conversation with a coachee of mine the other day, just reflecting back on something that had happened in their childhood. And the feelings of resentment towards the parents, because the coachee felt that the parents should have protected them in that situation. And so as we were busy unpacking it, was like, well, now that you're an adult, let's look at your parents through the eyes of empathy and look at some of the stuff that's playing out for you. And you're kind of doing the same thing. It's that the importance of being able to then look back and maybe forgive where you may have been holding on to resentment because you didn't fully comprehend that those who you thought should have protected you or should have made you feel safe weren't equipped to do so in any event.
I think it's about making peace with yourself and not really. I think when you hang on to grievances and grudges, and I think it hurts you more in the end. And I certainly knew as a therapist when patients didn't let go or didn't have that empathy, that their prognosis was not going to be great until they make peace with it and learn to just accept that maybe their parents did the best they could under those circumstances. But maybe it does take a degree of maturity.
Yeah.
And other ingredients. And some people never get there, and some get there too soon. It's kind of a pseudo-forgiveness, where they don't want to face the anger. So it's a very, very complex area that you're talking about.
That's an interesting concept that you just touched on now. Getting there too soon.
Getting there too soon, where you ward off the anger and the pain, and you think, no, it's fine, my parents were wonderful. And some people idealize their parents as a way of not thinking about the terrible experiences they had.
Sure.
So there are a myriad of ways of one deals with one's life.
Sure.
Or tells stories to oneself.
Can one recognize transgenerational trauma in others? Say, for example, people who are reporting to you.
I think it often goes unrecognized. So I think it often goes unrecognized individually, so it's going to go unrecognized there. But sometimes they'll know, for instance, if somebody's a gambler, they often manifest the same signs as a child of an alcoholic because they've had an unavailable parent or they're constantly vigilant.
Sure.
But it's quite a tall order to expect your employer to recognize transgenerational trauma. They can recognize maybe trauma through the depression, the anxiety, the conflicts at work, the eternal grievances, never feeling satisfied, disrupting the group.
Sure. One would, though, expect that in a country like South Africa,
yes,
I'll use South Africa as an example, with its history, that you would sit with maybe an abnormal percentage of individuals who are walking around with transgenerational trauma. That leaders in organization would almost need to be almost a little more aware of the fact that that may be in play, just given the context.
Well, given the context, I mean, you have so much corruption, which is rooted in a lot of deprivation. And people who've actually fought in the struggle became leaders and started getting very greedy and not really caring about anybody else. But also it was their way of getting even, very unconsciously maybe.
Well, now you're saying something very interesting. Say deprivation.
Deprivation, yeah.
could lead to people, once they're in a position of power, becoming greedy.
Greedy and corrupt and fraudulent. And I mean, you have it in big time in South Africa.
Sure. How do we
It's
deal
not
with
that they
that?
should take responsibility for it.
Mm.
But somehow their ideals all seem to get washed away and not interested in the common good. And becomes it's a very wounded country, very traumatized country.
That's true. It is a very traumatized country. What advice would you give to leaders who have to deal with people who may be suffering from transgenerational trauma?
Well, I guess all of them are suffering from it.
Yeah.
Which, so it's kind of thing. Even one of the big things in South Africa, I think, is also nannies leave their children very early on, separation.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have a ruptured attachment with their own children there. They have to bring up other children and be loving and warm and like the second mommy.
Yeah.
What do you think they must feel like? And their children are far away.
Now you're touching on a deep one.
Yes.
So you have, this is a lot of different emotions, I suppose, because on the one hand, it's the mummy having to take care of somebody else's child while her own child does not get her direct attention. And perhaps it is the grandmother who needs to step in. And that in itself would create trauma for the mother, but also trauma for the child.
Absolutely.
And that may play out for that child later on.
Yeah.
And you're reminding me of a documentary I watched a while ago. And there's this particular scene, and it's talking about the height of the documentary is about the height of apartheid. But there's this particular scene where you have the black nanny with the white child, a male child, and the little boy he's just taken a bath. So he's naked and she's busy drying him, but he's all playful with her. And you can see that there is a close bond between the two. But then the guy who's narrating in the documentary makes this comment that soon after that age, when this child needs to go to school, you have a different kind of separation there, because now he's pulled from the nanny and often at that time going to a boarding school, but then being told that he is superior to that caregiver, and the conflicting emotions that would cause. So you have the nanny with her trauma, her child back home with that trauma, then you've got another type of trauma that is playing out in that very same scenario.
It's not a good combination, is it?
No.
Not a good recipe.
No.
Of the pain and the hurt and the injustice.
Yeah.
That permeates the whole fabric of the society.
Yeah. Yeah, and then I remember when I watched that scene, I had to switch the video off because that was just too much to absorb at that time. And it took me a while to just digest that. But much of what we're seeing playing out in organizations have those underlying issues driving how people are interacting or showing up and how they're interacting with others. And I suppose in leadership positions, that self-awareness that we talked about in the first conversation, this would be a component of that.
Yes, I'd say one of the things that I think is very helpful in organizations is they call them staff groups, where the team meets like maybe once a week, to discuss issues.
Yeah.
And it's a way of metabolizing or digesting things and understanding the others and helping teamwork. And sometimes you need a paid facilitator.
I was just about to say that more often than not, it's probably better to have somebody facilitating the conversation who can hold the thing together, because
Even if you do it once a month.
Sure.
But that would be a very healthy way of helping things get digested and losses mourned, and understanding your colleagues and where things are coming from and what's going on.
Yeah.
It would be very healthy. And you have, and I think the bosses or the leaders should be part of it. So it gives you a space with somebody who can mediate.
Yes. Yes.
As a matter of course, and I think in they used to call it therapeutic communities, they have groups. That's why I think groups are so wonderful. It gives you the chance to work through these things, to understand in that kind of setting. Although an individual, behind every individual is a group, because they come from a family, but none of us is an island. We are dependent on each other.
Yeah, no, that's true.
Friendships, for connection, for warmth, for love, for everything.
Yeah. So, and that sounds to me like that is very good advice for organizational leaders, is to create the opportunities for those facilitated conversations to take place. And it makes absolute sense in my head that in the long run, the organization would benefit from it, because the more healthy a space your employees are, not just physically, but also mentally, and in terms of how they show up, the better of the organization is, and the more profitable the organization is.
I think so. And it gives you a chance to work through things, to understand. And I think it really, really does create a much healthier culture.
Yeah. But these are often the feely, touchy things, the hard, soft things that leaders tend to run away from, because we don't want to talk about those things.
I know, and people don't like to talk about difficult things, but that's where they get buried.
Yeah.
And then and that was one of the things I was going to say, what's not put into words gets reenacted in destructive ways. It's very important to be able to talk about difficulties, conflicts.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you know what? You can like somebody one day, not like them the next. That kind of ambivalence is very normal. And it's learning that that's very normal.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it could also be a way of healing difficulties.
So then it sounds to me like even where organizations may not see agency in the broader society, in taking responsibility for those feely touchy things, or to facilitate, to create those opportunities. So even if you don't see the agency in how organizations can help heal society, at the very least, you could see how it would benefit the organization, if leadership within the organization would have the courage to tackle these very important things.
I think so.
And stop looking at people as objects. Yeah. And I was in a conversation in a committee meeting not so long ago, and somewhere along the line, in the conversation, we were referring to human resources as assets, which had become commonplace over the years. And so, well, hang on, let's think about this, because if you're talking about HR as human, the people in the organization, and then we put this fancy thing on it, that they are our greatest asset. And it sounds nice and noble, but you use the word asset as if it's an object that belongs to you, that you
It's
own.
commodifying it.
Exactly, exactly. And the more and more we're using these types of words in referring to people, the more the easier it becomes for us to objectify people.
But it also becomes where we dehumanize. And that's where wars come in and real violence. Because you're not going to kill somebody when you look into their eyes.
Yeah.
And see them as a human being with a family, with children, with aunties and uncles and grandmothers and grandfathers, you know?
Yeah.
They're human, but it's a way you can only be violent when you're dehumanizing somebody.
Yeah. Yeah, sure.
So it's about also education, about both.
Yeah. But these are the things we are not taught in leadership.
They should teach them in schools.
Yeah. No,
that's about feelings, to talk about fears and anxieties. Everybody has them.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's quite comforting to know somebody else has them, because it makes you also not feel alone, which is why I think groups are wonderful.
Alone, and maybe there's something wrong with you.
Something wrong, and you keep it becomes a secret. Yeah. But actually, it's much more common than one realizes.
Yeah, yeah.
And everybody gets hurt, and they're normal parts of life. But it's about sharing and learning and recognizing that other people have it too. You're not alone.
Very important thought. So I think, I mean, the main advice or takeaway from our conversation today is that leaders need to proactively work on this aspect, the humanizing organization, and an effective way of doing that is to have these facilitated group conversations.
To set up those structures, yes.
To set up the structures but then understand it is at the most basic level, if one were to look at it through the lens of what is in it for the organization, it is, and the end of the day, the healthier your people are, the more successful the organization will be.
And the people will feel looked after, and they'll feel more loyal.
Yeah.
And then you create a great atmosphere where they're more productive. So it's a win-win.
Yeah. No.
And maybe they're difficult feelings, but you can work through those.
Yeah. No, I agree. Because it does seem like a lot of organizations are really just operating at transactional level.
Yeah, and the truth sets you free.
The truth sets you free.
Yeah.
And that's a great way.
And that's a cliche, but I think,
true.
Yeah.
That's very, very true. Absolutely. Great way for us to end this conversation. I do hope that those of you who've been watching, that at the very least, it has stopped you in your tracks a little bit to think and reflect as a leader on self first, in terms of what you may need to deal with within yourself. When we talk about trauma, transgenerational trauma, fascinating area. The more you start to look after yourself, the better position you are in to look after other people as well. But then think about, what is your role? What is your contribution in helping your organization, the people in the organization, to get to a healthy state? Pam, once again, thank you very, very much for your insights. Please don't forget to go and watch the first video if you haven't yet watched the video. Subscribe to the website. Whenever we add something new, you'll be made aware of it. You can also subscribe to the YouTube channel, and you'll always be aware of whenever any videos are being added. Thank you very much.